Hi, everybody. This is Alex from the COGEL Marketing and Communications Committee. This is the 50th anniversary of COGEL as an organization, not 50th anniversary of the conference. That'll be in a couple of years. But we're celebrating the 50th anniversary in Los Angeles this December at the conference. And leading up to that, I'm talking to some of the people who have been honored by COGEL over the years. And with me today is one of those people, Steve Berlin, who is the long-serving executive director of the Chicago Board of Ethics. And he received the highest award that COGEL can grant, which is the COGEL Award in 2023 in Kansas City. That award is given to an individual who's made substantial contributions to the field of, in this case, government ethics. Steve, welcome. So glad to have you here today.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining me. So Steve, as I think you were probably one of the first people I ever met when I started coming to COGEL, maybe back in, I think maybe my first conference was in Victoria, British Columbia, in the 2000 aughts at some point. And I think by that time you were already the executive director of the Chicago Board of Ethics. Is that right?
Yes, I was. I became actually the acting executive director when my former director, Dorothy Eng, who was a very active member in COGEL, retired in the fall of '06. And so my first conference was actually '06, and then I think it was '07 in Victoria, where
Okay.
that would have been my second conference. And oh yes, I mean, COGEL has been a mainstay of this agency and a mainstay of my life, of my professional life for decades.
Yeah. Uh,
So
Steve, had you worked at the Chicago Board of Ethics? You were what did you say, the assistant executive director, or no,
I was
acting?
hired, believe it or not, I was hired in 1993, September of 1993, as the deputy by Dorothy. And of course,
Wow.
that was before the days of email, unless you were in the Department of Defense or you were Al Gore.
Yeah.
The internet was just becoming a thing. And Dorothy, we didn't have it in the budget for two people to go to a COGEL conference, but every year Dorothy would go and she would come back and she would bring these fabulous materials. And at the time, we had a paper-based library of other jurisdictions' laws. Now, of course, everything is automated, it's on the internet, and the COGEL Blue Books are fabulous resources. But at the time, we used to have a cabinet full of ordinances and opinions from other jurisdictions, of course, including the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board. So,
This makes so much sense why you've been doing the ethics update for so long, because you and Paul Nick have been doing that for as long as I can remember coming to COGEL, have such an encyclopedic approach to that, talking about all the different things, that updates and the significant enforcement cases that have happened over the jurisdictions. We always feel like we're in really good hands with you guys. And now I see why. Like you're a real collector of this stuff, yeah?
luckily, it takes up a lot less space now.
Yeah, true. My boss is overwhelmed by the fact that, or with joy by the fact that I don't bring home piles of materials anymore. It's all electronic. So since 1993, I have noticed that those of us who there's a lot of us working in these fields who've been with our agencies for a long time. I've been with my agency since 2001. I was speaking with Amy Loprest, and she was with the Campaign Finance Board for a really long time. So what got you into this work back in 1993?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually. I graduated law school in '84, and it was the go-go Reagan years. And, I originally wanted to be a lawyer for the Securities and Exchange Commission. That didn't work out for whatever reason. I was in private practice for 5 years for a couple of big firms here in Chicago. And then I decided as I turned 30 that I needed a career change. And it was almost a chancy thing. I happened to run into a law school classmate of mine who had been a couple of years ahead of me in college. And during the time before he started law school and after he graduated college, he actually studied at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He got a pastoral degree, which I don't think he's ever used, but we had lunch and he said, Steve, why don't you consider being an ethicist? I said, Jim, I didn't know there was such a thing. Anyway, he had a good friend who later became a professor of mine at the University of Chicago. He said, why don't you call up my friend Robin Lovin at the University of Chicago Divinity School? You could probably do an advanced degree in ethics in a couple of years. And I did. So I met this professor and he said, absolutely. He said, you already have a terminal degree. He said, you could get a master's degree, not a pastoral degree, an academic master's degree in ethics in 2 years if you want to. And that's what I did. So I wasn't a full-time student. I went part-time and worked for a couple of not-for-profits, including one that dealt with judicial ethics during that time. Anyway, I got my degree and then I was looking for jobs, and one thing led to the other, and I ultimately got in touch with Dorothy Ang at the city of Chicago. Now, between the time that I first contacted her and sent her a resume and the time I got hired, that was exactly 2 years. But the ethics gods were watching. And so Dorothy hired me, first contacted her in June of 1991, and I began my job on September the 1st of 1993.
Wow.
I've been with the agency ever since. And I have to say that not only is it a fascinating area of law, it's just the nature of the work itself. It's the best job I've ever had. And I think the lawyers in this office would probably say the same thing. So, and I have a 40-year reunion, law school reunion coming up. I can probably count on one hand the number of classmates that have had a job as long as I've had this job. And I'll find out. I'll verify that.
So, Steve, I didn't know about your sort of background on the non-legal side, on the sort of the ethics side. You're one of those few people, sometimes you have an ethics board that is mostly composed of non-legal people that makes a lot of pronouncements, maybe doesn't have any enforcement power. And then sometimes you've got an ethics board, which is mostly lawyers who are figuring out case law. But you kind of bridge that gap. You're bringing both of those understandings in one person. That's probably very fortunate for the city of Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, the ethics degree I don't use that much, but as a kind of a theoretical background, it's always very interesting to me. I remember one time going through the code, and I think this is true of most ethics codes, and looking for what are the positive duties that people have as opposed to the negative prohibitions. And there really are very few. There are very few shalls. Fiduciary duty being one of the major ones. Most ethics codes are composed of, thou shalt not do X, Y, and Z. And there usually are, as I say, fiduciary duty, a couple of other things. Chicago, we have this weird provision in our ethics code that's called it's an unenforceable aspirational code of conduct, which provides things like, you shall treat members of the public with respect, but it's unenforceable. So that when we get complaints from citizens, hey, my alderperson hasn't returned my 30 phone calls and 60 emails, there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah.
We say, yeah, it's a violation of the aspirational code of conduct. Nobody cares.
Yeah, that thread I think has been talked about throughout the years. I think in Victoria actually there was a whole panel session that was on that, like aspirational codes of ethics versus compliance codes of ethics. So, but and this is exactly what I think the debate was about. Is the aspirational ones are great because they get to what we hope is going to be, the people aspiring to the ideals of public service, but then it's hard to create like an edifice of enforcement from those kinds of things.
It actually sometimes ends up making you look silly because
Yeah.
you've got these aspirational codes, but if people violate them, there's nothing you can do about it except,
Yeah.
In the office, we say, I'm sure every ethics office has some version of this. It's like you advise them to vote the bum out of office.
Yeah, that's right. So, Steve, you've had a bunch of different roles at COGEL. I mean, aside from being the anchor that has really that the ethics update has really been moored to for a long time. Thank goodness for you and Paul Nick for taking that work. What else have you done at COGEL? I know I've probably seen you on some panel sessions, but you've had some other official roles, yeah?
Yes, I was on when I first joined the steering committee, I headed up the publications committee. And so we did, we had a couple of interesting things. We reached out to the American, what was it? Not the American Society, the group that publishes Public Integrity, which is, I think, part of the American Society for Public Administration. And we had a couple of guests. They were mostly academics, a couple of guest pieces on, basically they were academic approaches to government ethics. and government ethics codes. And so we tried to, we branched out a little bit. That worked for about a year and a half, but I think that they were expecting that our people would provide them with some publications. But, COGEL is not, unlike that organization, COGEL's not composed of people who are professional scholars, who are publishing in peer-reviewed journals, for other academics. But we beefed up the reporter. I'm glad to say, that the COGEL Guardian comes out now. It's all online. It's a pleasure to read. So I worked on that. I worked on a number of other committees, including the Governing Documents Committee. So, COGEL, as an active organization, has to review its documents, its bylaws, its other governing documents on a periodic basis, and keep up with the times, because the nature of COGEL and the membership of COGEL has grown tremendously since we joined, since
Mhm.
you and I first became active in the late 2000s, mid 2000s. It's a very exciting thing.
And you're right, we do change over time. We change like how we're doing business, how we communicate with people. We've certainly feel like maybe at that British Columbia conference, there were probably 200 people, 250 people or something like that. So we're probably hit 500 this year, I think. So it really has grown. About that, do you have any observations just in the span of time that you've spent with COGEL over the year, like changes either in government ethics in general or COGEL in specific? Any observations there?
It's a very good question. In terms of government ethics, I'm not sure that any of us could say that our governments are any more ethical now than when we started as a whole. I can say that one of the major improvements that I've seen, not only in Chicago, but certainly in New York and Los Angeles and the other big cities, is ethics training. And I know that Mark Davies, one of your former executive directors, was a firm believer in ethics training. And we took that to heart. And back in actually going back to before I became that active in COGEL, going back to the mid 1990s, Chicago imposed a restriction on senior executive service employees, which is about 10 to 15% of the city's workforce, to take a face-to-face ethics training. And that's been in effect since the mid 90s. But in the mid 2000s, right around the time that I became active in COGEL, the city of Chicago imposed a restriction that requires everybody, all officials, all employees, all lobbyists, to take an annual online ethics training. And I would say that the most important reform, structural reform that I've seen in ethics agencies around the country is annual ethics training. I think it's absolutely critical. And not because that itself is going to keep people from making poor decisions, but what it does is it alerts people that they've got resources at their disposal and gets their antennae up. And I will tell you that you probably have experienced this in your office, but once we went to online training, the number of inquiries that we got up doubled in the first year. And it's basically stayed steady since.
Yeah, I think that's well said. We certainly noticed that, like, I've got a small training team here, and whenever we do like an agency-wide push, advice calls go up. Definitely. Like, I'll have somebody in the legal advice go, like, have you guys been over to this, health department? And yeah, and then I'm like, oh, that's why we've had this trend for the last couple of weeks. And I think online training is a part of that. And you're right, they're not going to know everything, but it gets them a chance to sort of create a little field awareness, and they know a place where they can get the questions answered. It also kind of sends a message to everybody, like, hey, the government does that. This is important. Like, people are thinking about this stuff, because sometimes, and before, I mean, we still do a lot of training face to face as well, but depending on how the agency or the part of the agency is set up, it can feel very far away from the norms that we think about in like office culture. Like, you think about guys working in a garage or working on a construction site, or just school teachers working in a school. People who are not like, the ethics lawyers are right down the hall. They could be miles away. So the training is one way to sort of link them back into that normative framework that our usually prescriptive ethics codes are trying to establish or maintain. I think it's really important too. Hey, so 2023 was your big year. I mean, every year is our big year at COGEL because it's such an amazing place to
It was
be in
Taylor
December.
Swift's and Travis Kelce's big year.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, and we were all in Kansas City, right? So in Kansas City, you were awarded the Kogel Award, which was really lovely to see. And I wonder if you could just talk for a second, like, what was that like for you? Either like when you found out you were going to get it, or that moment when you accepted it.
Well, I will tell you that it was a crowning moment of my life. There's nothing like peer recognition, Alex, and it is so absolutely gratifying. There's a part of me that says, I in some ways, having survived in Chicago for now more than 3 decades, it's like I'm the last man standing. Um, you know, but that aside, it was so gratifying because this work it's generally unheralded. And it's unheralded except when there's a major scandal. Okay.
Mhm.
And then people say, oh, there's an ethics board, but day to day, people don't pay much attention to it, which is why training is so important. But it was just, it was so gratifying to, number one, to just be recognized for having been in this business so long. And number two, just as a personal matter, it's at my age in my mid 60s now, it's like it's proof that if you stay at a field and you dedicate yourself to it, that you can actually do some good. So, whether all of us are doing good, I think we are. We don't get the kind of recognition that we deserve. But to get peer recognition is a wonderful, wonderful substitute for that. So,
Yeah.
it really is. And I will
And,
say
and
also that the mayor of Chicago said, are you the first person from Illinois to get this award? I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. So he was impressed with that.
oh, that's nice. That is really nice.
Illinois is, as you know, we don't have the state itself does not have the finest reputation for ethical behavior, and of course there is a famous war story from the previous conference that was held in Chicago back in December of 2008, which we were co-hosting, and that's when then Governor Rod Blagojevich got arrested by the FBI and charged with the U.S. attorney, and that was on the I think it was the Monday morning of that ethics conference. And I walked into the hotel and I've never seen so many government ethicists and lobbyists and campaign finance regulators, blaring away on their cell phones. And that, of course, that 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 hijacked all of the presentations that particular day. People were updating each other on what was happening with the then governor.
If I'm not mistaken, Steve, I was at that conference, and I think in the packet that we received when we got our little bags, and the opening page was this lovely letter about welcome to Chicago. Your work ethics is so important. So thank you for this work that you do. Love, Rod Blagojevich.
Yes, it's a classic document. I have it in my office.
I'm going to wrap this up now, but I want to thank you, one, for agreeing just to have this little interview today, and two, for all of the amazing things that you've done at COGEL. I think also you were on the programming committee. Maybe you and I served on the program
Yes, I
committee at
was on
some
the
point.
program committee the year that we hosted it, which was 2019. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
That
that's
was
right. That
very
was,
rewarding
yeah.
because you see how much work goes into the program committee and how many good ideas just don't make it. They end up on the cutting floor.
Yeah, and that's where, we're trying now with the COGEL Connects to give avenues for some of that stuff to happen. So these great ideas that don't quite make it in because we only have 40 or 45 slots or whatever, some of those sessions are now going to become part of the COGEL Connect programming throughout the year. So as our offers have expanded and ways to serve people have expanded, I hope that people we'll find other avenues for the exploration of those topics. But anyway, thank you for that, and I look forward to seeing you in what's I think, oh my goodness, it's only a couple months away.
Yeah, two
So
months away.
yeah, 2 months away. So I will see you there, and I thank you for your time today.
Alex, I will see you in Los Angeles and thank you so much.
Thank you.